He's one of my heroes, a person who's got a lot to say for us. And over the next hour, get ready to be enriched, get ready to be excited, and you're going to enjoy it. And join me in welcoming Jeffrey Tucker.
Very much. Thank you very, very much, and thank you for taking time to spend some time with me over the next few minutes. I came from the United States, the land of public denunciation, of ideological-driven mass murders, of warring tribes, and civic breakdown and chaos. So it was very interesting for me to show up here yesterday and immediately meet some very interesting and peculiar people. It seems like you are an unusual person. You seem to be willing to try new things, for example, as far as I can tell, and think new thoughts, even. It's almost as if you imagine that you have human rights. I'm not entirely used to it, is what I'm saying. It's a little shocking. In fact, the more I visit with you, it seems as if many of you have this theory that you should live a life of opportunity and dignity that comes from within and is not granted to you by the state. Am I right about that? That's it. Is that what's going on here? It's really interesting. What I'm trying to say is that it's very interesting, and I felt it. Maybe you felt it too when you came to this conference and meet other people. You're like, whoa, what's wrong with you? You imagine yourself to be free, like a free person. You know, this is unimaginable, you know? And what's fascinating to me, as I look back at the course of history and think about ideas and where we've been, is this. Your way of thinking, in fact, your existence, is not supposed to be possible. It wasn't supposed to happen. But it's happening anyway. For 100 years, they've tried to keep us all in cages and train us and beat us into submission, tell us what to do, to get us to comply with orders and edicts. And for whatever reason, at some point in your life, you sat down and said, wait a minute, I don't think that this is the way it's supposed to work, and I'm going to try to find a way out. It's very interesting. It necessarily makes you a kind of revolutionary, you know, of sorts. And you know this from friends and family and colleagues. People have considered you to be crazy, in a sense, you know? But the more you inhabit this way of thinking, the more it doesn't seem so crazy at all. It seems like what you're supposed to do. It seems like that's who you are, actually, and what you were born to be. And I think it's why at this conference so many people are talking about consciousness. You know, the Marxists used to talk about this, you know, let's raise the consciousness of they taught them a bunch of lies, essentially. But the consciousness raising that I'm seeing take place here is just a kind of coming to terms with your inherent dignity as a human person. Oh, you know, there's other interesting things about being here, too, that intrigue me. For so many of you, the idea of the country of your origin or where you're living right now, it's not part of your identity. It's just a part of your geography. You know, you look at a world map and you see nothing but geography with arbitrary lines on it drawn by authoritarian governments. I mean, it's a very interesting way to look at the world. Not everybody does. We're seeing the rise of nationalism take place all over the world. The other thing is that it's fascinating to me, you imagine and you hope for the possibility that you can get along with anyone under the right circumstances, right? Doesn't matter, race, religion, gender identity, the identity politics doesn't apply to you. You tend to look at other human beings as being valuable people just the same as you. And again, a very radical and sort of history-shattering perspective. It's like people don't think this way anymore. And so yes, you're in a minority, but the story I'm going to tell you, I hope, will encourage you to realize that what you believe is not weird, it's not strange, it's actually, you're the new normal. You are the normal. You're the reasonable person. You are the moderate person. You're the person who's thinking clearly and thinking actually on the trajectory of history, where we've been and where we're headed. All we have to do is get rid of this great interruption that stood in the way of real progress, and that interruption is called the 20th century, right? One of the great mistakes in the history of humankind. It was inorganic. It was artificial. What they did to us in the construction, and you need to think of it this way, the construction of a state without limit, a total state. It was unprecedented in history. And what I'm here to try to convince you of is that it is unsustainable. It is a paradigm that is disappearing before our eyes. In fact, it's crumbling by the day. You could. So, these are very interesting times to be alive. Times you will tell your children about and they will tell their children about, and people will be in awe of the fact that you are alive in these times and want you to tell the stories. And you can tell how you came to this conference at this event in this interesting land and held this beautiful event and got to know friends that you will keep for a lifetime. So it's a glorious time to be alive. I look back and I think, what is it like? Is it like, what is it like? Is it like the 1820s? Is it like the 1520s? I don't know, it's better than all those things. It's better than any moment of emancipation in history. But there have been many paradigms that have been shattered, broken down, only to enter into a new paradigm. That's what we're doing today. So what I would like to do in the time I have is to kind of give you an overview. Not of all truth, but of what I've learned through my own intellectual curiosity. And really my curiosity comes down to this. I mean, it's very interesting to me. It's like there was a moment in your life when you discovered this idea of freedom. And you couldn't be talked out of it, right? No matter how many people said, your strange idea of freedom, it's just wrong. You're like, well, I'm willing to consider that. But you woke up in the morning, you say, I still believe that shit. I'm sorry, I can't seem to shake it, right? So that happened to me too. But the thing I've always wondered about, and this is what I hope to give you some insight into, is something like this. Where did freedom come from? What gave rise to it? What did it do to human life? Why did we abandon it? And what are we going to do to get it back? All right, so that's the big agenda. I'm not saying I have all the answers, I don't. But I want to kind of give you the story as I see it, to maybe provide some insight to where we're going and what we should do about it. And before I do, let me say this too. There's something remarkable that's happening to what we used to call our movement. It was not too many years ago when they developed in the United States the thing we called the libertarian movement, right? And it lasted for a little while. It was very much organized around politics, and there was a lot of groupthink going along, a lot of seminars, people were reading a lot of books and everything else. And then it got riddled with factionalism, inevitably it did. The whole thing sort of fell apart and collapsed or whatever. And it was depressing for many people because they imagined themselves, and I think this was a mistake. The libertarians began to imagine themselves as a kind of special interest group that was going to grow and become really powerful and then persuade others and implement something like liberty, right? I think this is the wrong way to think about it. I think you all know this now. We've learned that that is not how you change history. How you change history is by looking internally, finding out where your value is and what kind of contribution you can make, and working with passion, diligence, and growing expertise in whatever area of life you're called to make a difference. And then together with all of us working in our decentralized, diffuse, but still very passionate way, gradually feed the revolutionary fervor that's growing around the world. And I think that's what's happening here today. So let's go back. Let's go back in time. I want to go back 500 years ago to ask this question: why did we come up with this idea of freedom? One of the reasons this history is a little bit invisible to us is that we've tended to adopt the wrong names for ourselves. All right? I have no problem with anarchism, by the way. In fact, I freely describe myself as an anarchist. And the reason is that people tend to trust you because you're not either a Republican or a Democrat. They're like, oh, well, that's interesting. Tell me more. It gives you kind of an opportunity, an opening. But actually, and people tend to think of anarchism as a kind of a fulfillment of libertarianism, if you will. I think this is all very confusing in a sense. The right word for us in history, and I think all of us actually can be subsumed within this one term, is the word liberal. Liberal. Our movement was born as liberalism. That's what it was always called. That word exists in every language. The liberal movement spanned 500 years, gradually emancipated humanity from authoritarian control. And it's just very tragic to me that in the course of the 20th century, we somehow lost the term. And it came to belong to somebody else. People who are increasingly giving up the term and calling themselves progressives. So to me, it's an opportunity. I'm very happy to call myself a liberal. So let's look back at the origin of liberalism. Where did it come from? 500 years ago, we began to see, in the midst of the religious wars in Europe, a lot of confusion about what is the basis of society. What is the thing that causes society to work in the first place, for it to be an orderly community in which we can thrive. And the mistake was believing that everyone within the same realm or living under the same regime had to have the same religion. And if they didn't, then people's souls would be threatened with damnation and chaos would break out. This became very difficult after the Protestant Reformation because everyone had to decide: are you going to follow Rome or the local minister, who's in defiance of Rome? And the religious wars went on for a very long time. They were extremely costly and very confusing, actually, for many, many people. I mean, if you lived in England under Henry VIII, it was very difficult. You couldn't believe in consubstantiation. You had to believe in transubstantiation, but you couldn't be loyal to the Pope. You had to be loyal to the king. And depending on what he believed, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but not Tuesday and Thursday, you could either be rewarded with favors from the court or find yourself with a head on a stone or an axe falling down on your neck, right? So on the same day, you had extreme Anabaptists and Protestants being killed, right next to papists. So it's a very difficult, confusing time. The insight, the original insight of liberalism was this: what if we just say, to hell with it? What if we allow anybody to believe anything he or she wants to, provided that person does not impose his or her beliefs on other people, and let's just see how that system works. Let's see how it goes. Because it's not working. These wars aren't working for us, right? So that was the idea. In fact, to understand that religious liberty was the origin of the modern origin of liberalism itself. It's extremely important. That's why you need to be very wary of anyone who tells you that that we need a homogeneous religious adherence in a society. I mean, that's a real rollback. That's a revanchist position, to think that you need to have a single religion in a society to make it coherent. Liberalism, modernity, civilization was born in this insight that you didn't have to impose a single religion, that you could have diversity of religion and it still worked. Now, I know maybe to all of you this just sounds like, oh, well, why did it take 150,000 years to come up with that insight? Well, liberty is hard to imagine. It's scary. We're going to do without an authority? We're going to have a society that just runs itself? We're not going to impose anything from the top? How is that going to work? Well, there was an experiment. It was tried, and it worked. Religious liberty worked for Europe. It brought peace. So, gradually, intellectuals and others said, well, you know, this idea of human liberties to believe what you want, maybe we can expand it outwards. So let's for example, attempt the following experiment. Let's let anyone write whatever he or she would like to write down, as long as they're not hurting others. We'll let people have the freedom to do so. And speech, we'll do that too. We'll just let anybody talk. And how about migration? Let's just let anybody move anywhere they want to move. And property, if you make money, you can keep it. And enterprise, if you want to start something new, you should be free to. We don't need monopolies. We don't need cartels in a country. Freedom, just simple freedom. And it was an amazing idea. And it changed everything. It's actually extraordinary just how the birth of liberty transformed life on earth, really, between, you know, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of the Renaissance, because all throughout the Middle Ages, this idea of human liberty began to grow, and for an interesting reason. No single power was able to monopolize force in society. Like the church wanted all power, the state wanted all power, localities and local monarchs and barons and lords, they all wanted all power. Everybody was struggling for power, but nobody could fully get it. And that was the reason liberty sort of gradually came to unfold. But by the 16th century, you began to see amazing things happening because feudalism was dying. The world of lords and serfs began to crumble, and people began to walk away. And how are they able to do it? Because of the freedom to migrate, the freedom to move, but extraordinarily, an institution came about that made such a difference. It was the invention, really wasn't the invention, it was the distribution and access to that amazing thing called money. Money. In other words, you would get paid in property that you could respend for something else, rather than just getting paid in the form of security and a plot of land and a place to live and clothes on your back. Now you had money in your hand, and you could go out and spend it on things that were being made available for sale for you. That was an amazing invention, because it began to shift the center of gravity of social life from the ruling class and the elites to the common person. The productive resources of society began to be dedicated to serving the common man and woman. That was an amazing shift, and look what it did. Look at the prosperity that was born in the 16th century as a result. This is the time of the Renaissance, with the Medicis and their growing banking empires, and the rise of beautiful art and music and glorious cathedrals. And you could hear the difference. You listen to the best piece of music written in 1450 and listen to the most beautiful pieces of music written in 1550, and you hear the difference. What do you hear? In 1450, everything is stuck. It's a static world of very tight harmonies and great repetition with very little development. In 1550, suddenly you had aspirational music, music that looked up and outwards, a music that celebrated the possibility, and this was amazing, the first time in history, the possibility of progress in one lifetime. Amazing. So you could become a teenager and go, you know, I can have a better life than my parents if I make the right choices about it. That insight that you can have progress and that the world could become a better place, ever more emancipated from poverty and from authority and imposition and coercion and control, was a beautiful and glorious thing. It eventually gave rise, of course, to the advent of what is sometimes called capitalism, which I think has a better name. It's just economic freedom is actually a better word for that. I don't really much like the term capitalism itself, but this freedom changed the face of the earth. It gave to us the middle class for the first time. That nothing like that had ever existed before. And if you look at the trajectory of the growth of emancipation between the 16th century and something like the late 19th century, it all seems inevitable. Ever more freedom. It seems inevitable. It wasn't. It's because people had to work for it. But it came about. So let me bump you forward. This is where the story begins to get interesting and a little bit dark. To the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1810. And if you could put like a bracket between 1810 and about 1908, we've got about a century there that sometimes historians call the Belle Epoque, or the beautiful epic, the age of laissez-faire, the most transformative century in the history of the world. During this century, we saw emancipation, this emancipatory movement, take on a radical dimension, eliminating slavery, for example, recognizing women as normative human beings deserving of full rights, something that a century earlier would have been unimaginable. And we saw the material conditions of life change. Now, just to be clear, these were the gifts of liberalism to the world, the gifts of you to the world. The ideas that you hold into your head gave humanity these great gifts. These are things that you should be taking credit for. You shouldn't be sitting in your bedroom being embarrassed about being an anarchist. You should go to bed at night and say, wow, my people, we emancipated slaves. You know, my people. We recognized universal human rights. My people. It was my people who saw that dignity belonged to all human beings without exception, that we liberated humanity from the state, from authority. We had a vision of freedom, and we stepped out, and we made it happen. And we saw how beautiful it was. How beautiful was it? Think of what happened from about 1850 to about 1890. Unbelievable. So in these years, we saw everything change. Internal combustion. Communication technology went nuts. I mean, people were calling each other on a telephone by the end of the 19th century. A century earlier, the fastest way you could ever communicate, and where there was not a where there was non-contiguous geographical realms, was by horses and smoke signals. Suddenly, you're able to call somebody and use a telegraph, which was the first great communications invention in the 19th century. But there were other things. Flight, unimaginable. People forget something like the commercialization of steel. There was an epic battle that took place between the technology of iron and the technology of steel. A lot of people put down steel and said it couldn't possibly work. Well, once steel became commercially viable, look what happened to our cities. They shot up into the air, and we were able to traverse large bodies of water and use our new internal combustion engines to pass over them. We began to, through human hands, reconstruct the status of life on Earth. And look what it did to humanity. The population exploded 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. Incomes went through the roof. We were living ever longer lives. Infant mortality collapsed to a fraction of what it was a century earlier. Life on Earth fundamentally changed thanks to liberalism. By 1890, it seemed obvious to all of us, all of our ancestors, the people who believe what we believe here tonight, that humanity had found the answers, that we knew the path to peace and prosperity forever. And who could ever doubt it again? They were wild optimists. And it's fascinating to me when you read some of the writers of Victorian England, just how they thought that the world's problems really came down to there were too many people who didn't know how to use a fork properly, this sort of thing. I mean, the problems were going away. We successfully eliminated slavery. We were building up our cities. They were shooting up to the clouds. Flight became a real possibility. Our homes were now lit with this new thing called electricity. Very radical technology. A lot of people said it would never catch on, Too dangerous, Gonna burn down the place. It's probably a bubble, But it caught on. Oh, here's what's interesting, too. Who were the rich in the 1890s? They weren't the old ruling classes. Not in America. It was the new immigrant classes. It was not the people who went to the right schools and went to finishing school, or were born of the right stock, or were attached to some sort of dynasty. It was the immigrant families. It was the Scottish and the Irish and the Jews. Suddenly, this first generation, people who had, when they were 8 years old, working on moving logs through rivers. People who had been doing child labor since they were very young and had adopted a commercial ethos and fell in love with the idea of meritocracy. That if you work hard, you can be great, you can be rich, you can change the world, you can embrace new technologies. They were the genuine progressives. I mean, I despise the way, in our public school classrooms, people look down on this generation and call them robber barons, This is ridiculous. This first generation immigrants who built the great technologies of the late 19th century were radicals. And they were, in previous ages, the marginalized people began to take over the world. And it was a beautiful thing to see. What's not to like? Everything's beautiful. Why didn't we stick with it? What did we do? Why did we overthrow it? Why was it that 20 years later, everything had changed? So I'm talking about World War I and following. Why did we do this to ourselves? And here I think we have to look back and examine the darker undercurrents that were taking place at the same time in the 19th century. Two very grim and dangerous intellectual movements which trace all to one source. And that source is George Friedrich Hegel, the early 19th century German theorist, a hater of liberalism, a man who thought that history did not consist of things that you and I do, things that you and I choose. History is not something we make happen on our own. History is something that happens to us through great waves and like a wind that blows above us, that just buffets us from place to place. And his historiographic, phantasmic imaginings really caught on in German academia. And out of Hegelianism of the early 19th century came two terrible anti-liberal movements. People who resented and warned about liberalism, that it was a terrible thing, that it was going to destroy the world. There was a right-wing version of Hegelianism, and there was a left-wing version of Hegelianism. The right-wing version of Hegelianism imagined that history would culminate in mastery and rule by the Prussian state working with the Prussian church to unify the nation with a single objective, a single vision under a dictator. The left-wing version of Hegelianism said, no, It's not about the nation. This is going to happen all over the world. It's not about nationhood. It's about the collective of humanity. We're going to ascend into a new place of common ownership and common thinking. And yes, there will be a central directives that will work on behalf of the workers and peasants all over the world. And this vision was called socialism, right? So socialism and fascism, what we in the 20th century came to call this, were born in the 19th century as two iterations of the same anti-liberal movement. Now, I think we know something about the history of socialism. At least I was taught this in school, the left-wing version, they culminated in Marx. We know far less about the right-wing version of it, which is the subject of my new book, Right-Wing Collectivism. And I traced through the rise of this anti-liberal movement through the works of people like Fichte and Thomas Carlyle in England. It's a very interesting guy, this guy Thomas Carlyle. Said, liberalism is a terrible idea. I get shivers thinking about a world of universal emancipation and freedom where everybody's like trading with each other and getting rich. This is dreadfully boring. Who wants that? What we need is a world of great men ruling us, of entrenched hierarchies, of wars, and people on the march, and big cataclysmic shifts that require bloodshed and sacrifice. Yeah, I read Carlyle, and I'm like, listen, you're a monster, I don't want your world. But this is the world he wanted. And he was a very interesting guy. He said, the people he hated the liberals, and he especially hated the economists. And he's the guy who gave the term economics the term the dismal science. He said the science of economics is so dismal that they even imagine something as terrifying and horrible as a world without slavery. That's what he thought was so dismal about economics. They imagined a world without slavery. That was Thomas Carlyle. His followers were very interesting people. People like John Ruskin, who despised the new commercialism of the age of liberalism that emerged in the late 19th century. He couldn't stand it to see large factories doing things like producing silk stockings for peasant women. What kind of world is this? This is terrible. The ruling class is losing all status and all power. What will happen to our nations? What will happen to our dynasties? What will happen to our race? To our religion? It's all going away. If these liberals have their way, we will lose everything that constitutes our identity, everything that's beautiful in life. And then, probably the worst thing of all, was the emergence of scientific racism in the late 19th century. It's very interesting if you look back at the subject because it was born in anti-liberalism. Out of the conviction that people should be managed like a good rancher manages farm animals, essentially. Look, a good owner of animals on a ranch does not just allow unlimited procreation by just doesn't let the animals do whatever they want. If you're going to manage society, above all else, you have to manage the demographics. And so they began to classify us. What race are you? What is your heritage? What kind of behaviors can you engage in that are eugenic, meaning improve the race, versus dysgenic, meaning diminish the race? And this caught on. And this view was held very widely by the ruling classes, the anti-liberal ruling classes of the late 19th century. And it combined very well with a lot of the dark and grim ideas that had been out there before, from Carlyle, from Hegel, from Fichte, from the German protectionists that have been rising. And that melded very well with the left Hegelians and their socialist dreams of a perfectly managed society of universal equality imposed from the top down. And there became this kind of weird perfect storm that emerged with World War I. But really, the problems began before then. It began probably in the 1910s. That was when the first experiments came about, at least in the United States, with the idea of regulating our associations. The very first form of regulation was, of course, because this is a movement obsessed with sex, actually, with demographics, marriage licenses, right? Marriage licenses. Like, you can't get married, meaning you can't plan a family without state permission. The origin of that was scientific racism. And then out of that comes the very first labor regulations. I cannot make a deal with you to trade and exchange labor for money without first going through the government to set wages and to permission people into the workforce to make sure you're the right age, to make sure you're charging the right price. Part of the motivation here was to exclude marginalized peoples. Because as I said, with the rise of commercial society came a gigantic demographic upheaval. Like, the poor began to get rich. And then the rich were starting to live a very long time, much longer than they were supposed to. And the ruling class began to get very, very panicked. It's fascinating because this happened on the right, but also happened on the left. Like when you look at Karl Marx, right? So he goes and visits England. He goes, I thought England was supposed to be this beautiful land of aristocracy, when people, riding up and down the streets and horse-drawn carriages, greeting each other with loving greetings, at the beginning and the end of the day. What I see in London instead is orphans everywhere. They're strewn throughout the streets. And old people, God, they look so sickly. They're walking around with canes and their teeth are falling out. And clearly, whatever system we have here is making the world a worse place. Look. You know what he didn't see? He didn't see this crucial fact. 100 years earlier, it's true. It's true. None of those people would have been on the streets. You know why? They would have all been dead already. It was a mistake. He confused the flourishing of society in the early stages of modernity with a rise of poverty. It was untrue. And then you had the right-wing version. Wrong people are mixing with the wrong people. The wrong people are getting rich. What is it going to become of the WASPs, the dynastic owners of this country, as long as we have people like Southern Italians and Slavs and Jews, of all people, pouring in here and getting rich at our expense? So there was a conspiracy, and it was born, and it came about in the early years of the 20th century. A wicked conspiracy to give us this unprecedented thing called the total state. And it was to be total. And it came on like a mad rush, like a volcano that swallowed our city of freedom and covered us with horrible muck and catastrophe. Like what we had left behind 500 years earlier suddenly came rushing back to us. And they seized control of everything so fast over the course of like 10 and 15 years. In 1890, imagine this. You could travel anywhere in the world without a passport, without documentation. You just showed up. Amazing. We can't even imagine it. Here's another one. See if you can imagine this. Maybe you can. If you make money, you can keep it. Right? Like, all of it. Every penny was yours. That's an amazing world. Suddenly, 1913 in the United States, those days were over. Suddenly, the government gave you permission to own what you owned, and it would take a portion. Passports. The world had never seen such a thing like that. Listen, this passport crap, I'm sick of it. It's like I have a recurring nightmare of losing my passport. Do you have is this just me? I don't know. I'm always like terrified I'm going to lose my passport all the time. Passports are stupid. Or maybe they're great. I want 200 passports. Wouldn't that be great to have 200 passports and just, I don't know, and an app, you just like Anyway, there wasn't passports before World War I. And you could engage in any kind of labor you wanted, any kind of age could work. You know, there weren't child labor laws. And this is a particular fixation I have. I think child labor laws are a hardcore violation of human rights. I don't know why we have them at all. I think they should be completely eliminated. I think it's incredibly cruel what we do to our children. And they did it for humanitarian reasons, oh sure. Right. You know, if you have a 15-year-old, 14-year-old kid who's desperate to work and finds that he can't, is that humanitarian? No, it's absolutely cruel. No, we have to stick them in prisons, public school prisons, and indoctrinate them, you know, and then make sure they're fed into college, where they take out a $100,000 loan and live in debt slavery until they're 35 years old. You know, that's the right way, right? That's the humane way that we're told. Anyway, everything changed. And you know what made a huge difference? And this was amazing. The advent of central banking. So, right? It's very interesting what happened. Money came to be nationalized. By the way, I'm a little lost in my time. I mean, I'm afraid that you're worried I'm going to go speak for 5 hours. How are we doing on time? Okay, right. Well, because, you know, I've only got, really, I only have 4.5 to go. No, what, 6:30. Oh, right. Okay, great. So central banking. Just so you understand, World War I would have never happened without central banking. It was not, I mean, this is empirically true. It was only because governments imagined that they had a blank check, that they thought that, hey, let's just blow up the whole world. Let's just draft everybody, consider every single civilian living in a country as an enemy combatant, and force people to go out and kill and make them swear that they're willing to lay down their life for the state. And if they refuse to do this, we'll shoot them in the head. Right? Unbelievable. This was ghastly. This is not modernity. This was 500 years ago. This is a revanchist despotism that we were supposed to have left behind. And what paid for it? The central bank. The central bank. Now, let's be clear on this. The national banks were bad enough. That was banks established by governments to serve governments, right? We had those in the United States. They're all over the world. They always sucked, but central banks were different. Every single bank would be a member of the same consortium and cartel, and all these would be permissioned in by the state. And their primary objective of the entire banking system was to float and keep alive government debt so the government could spend forever. And we'll give them, the central bank, the right to print to cover these debts anytime a crisis comes about. So what does this say to states? You have unlimited power. You can do anything you want. There are no more limits. You don't even have to tax anymore. You just print the money. This is a magic printing press. And what did governments do with their glorious new power is very interesting when you read back 1912. What's the central bank going to do? What's it going to do for us? They're going to do wonderful things. The central bank will end banking crises, right? It will end inflation. It will stabilize the economy because we'll have very smart people in charge of them. Really? That's really what we're going to have? Oh, sure, we're going to use science and manage the economy better. And they said, okay, let's create it. Let's see what happens. Boom! Right, the world blows up. Suddenly, aerial bombings of cities. You know, a whole population's drafted to kill and be killed. A total war that shattered the civilization of Europe and unleashed this nasty, nasty virus called nationalism on the planet. We had worked so hard for so long to get rid of tribalism, of nativism, of racism, and all the horrors that you associate with that, the statism that comes with that. And what did the central banking in World War I do? They entrenched it, they unleashed it and entrenched it and made it the primary model for the world. And said to governments all over the world, control your people, manage your economies, bully everyone into submission, control speech, tax incomes, interfere in people's rights to associate, control whom people are allowed to love and marry and make commitments to. And it became worse and worse. And the philosophers, what happened to the liberals? Very strange. I think something happened in the late 19th century. They got lazy. They got overconfident. They began to believe that their vision of the world was inevitable. Who couldn't see the beauty that liberalism had given rise to? We don't have to do anything anymore. And suddenly, 1925 comes along, and we practically vanished as a species. There were very few liberal intellectuals left at all, writing, at least in the English languages, actually all languages, all European languages, by the mid-1920s. And we found ourselves in a terrible situation, a great competition between the socialists on one hand and the fascists on the other. And that was your choice. Democracy, liberty, human rights, freedom to migrate, freedom to associate, dignity of the individual rights. No respectable person believed in that stuff anymore. It was all gone. And the philosophers and prophets of tyranny began to take hold. And they were horrible, horrible people. And I just want to highlight one in particular, the thoughts of one in particular. Oh, here's an example. It's not the guy I want to talk to, but there's a German thinker named Werner Sombart. Very interesting guy. In 1910, 1915, he was all about socialism. Oh, the masses must rise up and overthrow the capitalist exploiters, and then we're going to establish a world of perfect equality, and Marx is exactly right, the greatest economist in human history, we should all follow Marx. By 1935, his views had slightly changed, except not much. Now, we must all rally around the blood, the race, and the German people, and follow this great new leader named Hitler, who's going to lead us into a promised land and save us from liberalism. Hitler was an interesting guy. Why? He was just a trash can who attracted a lot of flies, I tell you. You know, Europe was strewn with these strange, jobless, and actually impoverished second and third generation members of the aristocracy that had been overthrown in the 19th century. And they were just wandering around with small bands of followers, you know, Lord Kuckelface and Baron Julius, you know, and all these other, these freaks, essentially. And they were seething about the fact that their status and their power had been vanquished by the rise of liberalism. And they were furious about it, and they wanted to do something about it. They wanted to destroy human liberty and bring back a rule by the aristocracy, a revanchist philosophy. Let's reclaim what we've lost as aristocrats. One of my favorite of this guy named Baron, he claimed he was a Baron, God knows, Baron von Julius Caesar Evola, right? And he wore a monocle. Can you believe that? Monocle. People tell me I should have a monocle. No, I don't want a monocle. This guy was like this guy thought like the violence was a sacrament, you know. He thought that the role of women was really they should all be rounded up and live in a permanent harem, you know. I mean, this guy hated everything about capitalism, everything about modernity. He hated everything except himself and his handful of friends. And he thought Hitler was a sellout. Actually, he was asked during the Nuremberg trials, "Are you a Nazi?" He said, "No, I'm not a Nazi. No, if you could describe me as an uber Nazi, you know, a mega Nazi, you know, an extremist Nazi, but a Nazi, no, sellouts, not my type." But let me tell you about a very interesting guy. His name is Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt. I have been terrified to read this guy's works. Did you ever have anybody recommend a book to you and you think, "Nah, I don't want to read that"? This went on for 20 years. Everybody's like, "You really need to read Carl Schmitt." "No, I don't want to read Carl Schmitt." "No, you should read Carl Schmitt." "I don't want to fucking read Carl Schmitt." Finally, I read Carl Schmitt because I had to because of this book. This guy, I was just like, I couldn't even sleep. Couldn't sleep. So let me tell you the most powerful critic of liberalism of the 20th century. And I want to present to you his views really quickly so you can understand his thinking, all right? So he writes a book called God, I don't remember the name. It's his main treatise on politics. I think that was the name of it. Anyway, it's like, okay, now here's the great issue. Here's the great question of our time. Should we follow liberalism, universal human rights, and all that kind of stuff, or should we follow the Nazis or the communists? Take your pick. Doesn't matter. Well, Carl Schmitt says, let's be clear what the debate is. These liberals imagine a world without politics. Now, I'm reading that going, yeah, sounds good. He doesn't like it. Doesn't like it at all. He says that would be very boring. Just people accumulating wealth, making choices, getting ever richer, moving around, engaging in fripperies, I don't know what, watching movies or something, hanging around at Anarchapulco. We can't have that. What we need is a life of drama, of excitement, and leaders. It's kind of a Carlyle. He was in many ways the culminating moment, the penultimate figure in the revolt against liberalism. So he says, so what is politics? Politics, ultimately, is this. It's a world in which humanity is divided between friends on one hand and enemies on the other. So for your life to have meaning, you have to have friends, of course, but you also have to have enemies. Liberalism imagines a world without enemies. That is not an exciting life. To hate is to live. So who are our friends and who are our enemies? He asks. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. As long as there's somebody. Who will decide who they are? The state will decide for you, and everyone will go along with it. So it doesn't really matter, as long as we have friends and enemies. Now, he has a theory of eneminess. He thinks that eneminess is not just you sit around sort of seething, going, yeah, I don't like that guy. That's not it. Bloodshed, the willingness to kill, actually to observe bloodshed, real blood, flowing from your enemies' bodies is what eneminess is. So you have to have, in order to have a dramatic and exciting life, you have to be surrounded in many ways by the ever-presence, at least the threat, but actually the reality of bloodshed. It's got to be there. Otherwise, you're not living a very interesting life. So his theory, really, if you want to reduce it down to a simple slogan, is this. The path to a good life is through death. Mass death. The more death, the better the life. Carl Schmitt's theory of politics. Top anti-liberal theorist of the 20th century. Major league Nazi. Okay. If you want to know more about this guy, I've got it written all the way. I don't even like talking about the subject because it's just so grim and so terrible. You know why it's interesting to reflect on all this stuff? My book ends in 1957, but actually the theory of the total state, it just really marched on and on with very little dissension. Yes, we know a handful of names. My friend Murray Rothbard, what a great man, right? What a great man. He dared rethink everything. And when I met him, I remember I used to hang around with him, and he stayed up all night, And so he'd keep me up all night, scandalizing me with his latest, outrageous thought. I used to look around and make sure nobody heard, what he was saying, because it's so appalling. And wonderful. He loved shattering orthodoxies. But there was the great Mises, and there was Hayek, there was E.C. Harwood, who founded my institute that I work for now, American Institute for Economic Research, was founded in opposition to the New Deal. There were great heroes in the 20th century, but really, the total state didn't really lose its captivity over the human mind until very recently. Until, I would say, in 1995. Two great things happened in 1995. Well, not two great things, two momentous things. One is my friend Murray died. The second thing is that God invented the internet web browser to replace him. Okay? So it worked. It worked. And so from that moment on, we began to see the gradual freeing of the world. I like to reflect on this history for one main reason. I think it's important for us all to understand something. The enemy we fight is an artificial imposition. It was chosen for us at a distinct moment in time, the early 20th century, for the most part. Of course, the ideas of despotism have always been around, but the reality of the total state is a relatively recent invention. It's extremely fragile also, because it relies most fundamentally on this implausible proposition. You will believe that you need a master telling you what to do, stealing a third of your income, restricting your travel, telling you who you can associate with, what you can say, what you can believe, what you do with your life. The moment you stop believing in that, you have dealt a blow to this total state, because it's your belief that's central to their rule. And if enough people stop believing in the lie, it's not sustainable anymore. And I look at things like this. In early 1962, a poll was taken of the American people. It said, do you trust the federal government to do the right thing? 65% said, well, sure. Yeah, I like to laugh, right? Yeah, what? What's wrong with these people? What? 65%. Now, 18%. 18%. That is not sustainable, my friends. It's not sustainable. You can't do it. You can't do it. Every system of statism relies fundamentally on consent. You have to go along. The minute you stop going along with it, their power is diminished just a little bit. And I'll tell you something else. It's very interesting. How many of you in this room have read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions? Or at least heard of it? Yeah, right? So the people who do are like, yeah, I know that book. Yeah. So it's a very interesting. He has a kind of model of how things change. He says it goes something like this. We're all kind of, in a sense, controlled by the ideas around us. That every culture has a prevailing belief system. He applied it mainly to science, but it applies to politics, applies to all of life. There's something that we all kind of believe. We don't always recognize what it is, but we absorb it from those people around us. It's a prevailing paradigm, he called it. And you believe something. You believe that there should be slavery, for example. Yes. You believe that people should be either lords or serfs, you know? You believe that white should deserve supremacy. You know, you believe that women should always live in a subordinate role. Whatever the thing is you believe. And you just accept it because that's what's around you. And then something strange starts happening. Things go on that are inconsistent with the prevailing paradigm. They are what he calls anomalies. Anomalies begin to appear that aren't explained by the theory that you hold about how the world works. And it kind of confuses you a little bit, you know? You're like, wow, 10 minutes, okay. You're kind of like, wait, how does what I observe fit in with a prevailing paradigm? Oh, forget it, don't worry about it. But you know what happens after a while? These anomalies begin to pile up over time. And more, and every day you wake up, you're saying, you know, this is inconsistent with what I'm supposed to believe. I think I'm not going to believe that anymore. And when enough people start rejecting the prevailing paradigm, you get what he calls a paradigmatic shift. And it works like this. The prevailing orthodoxy begins to crumble down gradually in ways you can't entirely identify, but it happens in a diffuse way. Fewer and fewer people believe the old thing, and more people are prepared to believe a new thing. It's called a pre-paradigmatic stage, because the old paradigm is no longer compelling anymore. I would say statism is that old paradigm. It's no longer compelling anymore. And we've now entered into a new time, a pre-paradigmatic time in which nobody knows what the hell to believe anymore. Everyone's really confused. I mean, not you. You know. This is why you're very important to taking this pre-paradigmatic moment and turning it into a new paradigm. Okay, I only have a few minutes left, but let me just say this. I never thought that I would live to see the day when the central bank monopoly would be broken down through a new technology that would fundamentally challenge the state's monopoly on money. I didn't believe it was possible. I had reasons why I thought it was impossible, which is why when I got an article in my email in 2010 explaining Bitcoin to me, I read it and said, I don't understand a word of this, but I'm not going to run it, delete. Now, I should have written back Satoshi and said, no, not really. No, I did write him back, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to endorse your weird product. God, what an idiot, right? How many of you have learned humility because of Bitcoin, right? Humility, right? Gotta wait and see. The impossible might be possible. God knows. I don't know. Maybe it's possible to make magic internet money. It turns out. I don't know. I never thought. I was an expert. I had read every book. I wrote my undergraduate thesis. It was like 185 pages on monetary theory. I knew everything. I knew what money was, how it worked, and what it could and could not do. And I knew that Bitcoin was a fake, a fraud, a phony, a Ponzi scheme, whatever. Just like all those jerks at Morgan Stanley are saying now, or whatever they're, Or there's a guy from Berkshire Hathaway yesterday that called it a con. And God, he's like 94 years old. I mean, dinosaur, die already. So look, I'm not here to tell you that our liberation comes from Bitcoin becoming the new money. It's not going to happen. Or it could be somebody else, right? Here's what's crucial. It's not that crypto has to become the dominant money. All we have to do is break the monopoly. That's it. So, central banking, and let's review very quickly. Central banking is the printing press for the total state, without which it has no power to do what it does. No World War I, no vast regulatory state, no imperial wars. I mean, none of it would have been possible without central bank. Central banking relies fundamentally on two things. That the state be the sole only issuer of currency, number one. And number two, all that currency must flow through the same system. You see? So you come up with a private currency, a non-government currency, something that people can actually use instead of national money, and make it global, make it shatter borders, make it democratic, make it available to anyone with the right technology. You've already broken down a major part of that monopoly, and then make it possible for everyone to essentially become his or her own banker. Now the state has a major, major problem on its hands. And you know what I think? This is why it's so brilliant. Do you just love getting up in the morning reading about all this stuff, right? I mean, it's just glorious to be alive, to see it all shattered. I think, before I say that, I know the person who introduced Janet Yellen to Bitcoin. Funny scene. She goes to the office, to the Federal Reserve, sitting with the Board of Governors, puts up on a screen a QR code, holds up her phone, scans it, clicks a button, sends them money. Janet Yellen's like, what did you just do? Well, I sent money. What kind of money? Well, it's this digital money. It's the thing. It works up double key cryptography. I don't understand anything you're saying. What was the financial intermediary you used to make that transaction possible? There wasn't one. It went directly from me to them, and they can do the same thing. Bypassing the banks entirely? Yes. And where can this be done? Anywhere in the world. Between whom? Between anyone and anyone else. Janet Yellen just turned white. Never seen anything like it. All right. Here's the thing, my friends. You know what it is? Here's the thing. They didn't catch on fast enough. History's moving too fast for these bureaucrats. The ruling class is slow. They're lazy. History is moving forward at a mighty speed all over the world, independent of nations, independent of states. You're doing it. Millions of other people are doing it around the world. You know what it is? It's too late. It's too late for them. They can't catch up. It's done. Listen, we don't need to take our revolution for granted. You have to believe. Don't make the mistake that the liberals did in the late 19th century, thinking all this was inevitable, that you don't have to work for it, that we don't have to convince people, that we don't need a culture that loves and embraces and understands liberty. That is up to us. Every one of us has a job to do in our lives, to spread this message in the belief in human rights, the belief in the possibility of universal human dignity, the rejection of tribalism, of collectivism, of racism, of statism, a belief fundamentally in emancipation for the whole world, material, spiritual emancipation. Believe in these things, live these things, preach these things, and teach these things so we can entrench this revolution all over the world. Let's leave a free society to our children, to the next generation. May the history of the next 100 years look back at you, at this conference, at this day, this hour, and say, those people were great people because they believed in something wonderful. And they had the courage and the conviction to overthrow a system of slavery, death, and destruction and give us something wonderful, a free world. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jeffrey Tucker.
Thank you.
There was an idea
to bring together a group of remarkable people
to see if we could become something more.
So when they needed us, we could fight the battles
that they never could.
In time, the state will know what it's like to lose. To feel so desperately that it's right, yet to fail all the same. Dread it. Run from it. Freedom still arrives.
Vacate the state. Engage all the speakers and get this man a microphone.
Fun isn't something that one considers when eradicating tyranny. But this does put a smile on my face.
you guys.